Excellence in our industry comes from quality teams creating quality products. In an industry that's constantly evolving, it's your unwavering grit, determination, and passion that drives innovation and elevates standards to new heights. As brewers ourselves, we know what that passion looks like. It's the drive to create something exceptional, fueled by dedication and love for the craft. As a stainless steel equipment manufacturer for over 10 years, ABS Commercial provides a full consultative approach to our customers, from consultation and design to installation and ongoing care and maintenance. Whether you're in planning, just getting started, or looking to expand, we're here to support your growth and your success. Thank you for choosing ABS Commercial as your trusted partner.
Hey everybody, my name is John Szymankiewicz. I'm with Beer Law Center, and thanks for joining us today in my little section of this virtual conference. Thanks to ABS for sponsoring or being one of the sponsors for this. And of course, thanks to craft beer professionals for putting this on, and as always, making the content available free for everybody forever, hopefully, at least available on their YouTube channel. Again, appreciate you taking the time to listen to me a little bit today. We want to talk about an employee handbook, what it is and why you should have one. So I'll first start with giving you a little bit of background in case this is the first one of my talks that you've been to. I try and do one of these every time craft beer professionals has an opportunity. I love talking with people, love talking about beer. I love talking about the law and beer, which is somewhat unusual. Maybe I'm a masochist. Anyway, my name is John. I'm an attorney. I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm with Beer Law Center. All we do is work with alcohol law. We work with breweries, wineries, distilleries, kombucheries, meaderies, cideries, any kind of eries that are out there that have to do with alcohol, and as well as just alcohol sellers, tap rooms, restaurants, that sort of stuff. We practice in North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, and DC. But on federal stuff, trademark, TTB licensing, that sort of stuff, we represent folks all over the country and would be happy to talk to you about your project. I tell people that if I can't do it or I can't do it for you, I can help you find somebody who can. I'm very fortunate to work with craft brewers and the alcohol industry like yourselves, but also the alcohol attorney world is a pretty small world, and we kind of all know each other. So, if you need contacts in your state, let me know. I probably have one over there. Happy to chat about it. Happy to refer these other great folks' business. Anyway, all right, on with the topic. What's an employee handbook and why you should have one? So let's start with our outline. What are we going to talk about a little bit today? Employees in HR, risks. Go into some details about an employee handbook. I'm going to categorize things into policies you have to have, and then they should have policies, and then best practices, and if we have time, what not to do, which is more of the horror stories and war stories of previous clients. So when we talk about an employee manual, what we're talking about is a tool for managing your employees. Ostensibly, it is a tool for employees to look at and understand what the rules are, what the policies are, what the expectations are, and what the processes are. But it's also critically important for you as a manager, owner, or leader in a alcohol environment, a production environment or sales environment, or any time you have employees, to be able to consistently make decisions and treat people fairly and within the law. Okay, so what kind of are the issues here, right? What are, and I label this employees and human resources, the main things we tend to think about for employment law problems or employment law issues are the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. There's a federal version. Most states have a version of the Federal Labor Standards Act. The Federal Act sets the floor. Everybody in the country has to do at least this. States can do more than that, but they can't do less than what's in the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. We also talk a lot about employee classification. And so what do I mean by classification? Well, full-time is different than part-time. Part-time is different than an independent contractor. And even in those groups, like within full-time, you've got exempt employees and non-exempt employees, and they both have different standards that they need to be measured by in terms of what you should do or what you have to do for them, what rights they have, those sort of pieces. So how you classify an employee is critically important to being able to comply with federal and state law. We also talk a lot about ADA compliance, right? What is reasonable accommodation and what do you have to do for an employee or what you should do for an employee in terms of adjusting their work environment, adjusting their work to compensate or to not compensate, but to accommodate for potential disabilities they may have. People always worry about discrimination and fairness. That's where we get a lot of litigation type stuff coming around. Wrongful termination. How, is this person no longer here and did you have the right to fire them or lay them off or however that has worked in your organization? And then harassment and work environmental issues. One of the things that I want people to understand, and for myself, I came from I used to work in a chemical plant, a pharmaceutical plant before I became a lawyer. And so as I've been an employee my whole life, right, till I finally started a law firm. And I always viewed human resources, okay, they're here for us employees. That is absolutely not the case. Human resources are there to help protect the company and to do that through making sure that they comply with the laws and avoid risk. So, if you are an owner or manager of, in this case, a brewery or something like that, you need to look at human resources not as a pain in the ass, not as a, well, I'll get to it if I need to, or I'll get to it when I can, or when we're big enough, we can do this. You need to think of it as a must-have function if you've got more than one or two employees. Now, that human resources doesn't always mean a person dedicated for that, but you have to dedicate some chunk of your brain to what do I need to do for managing people at a human resources level. And I'm not talking about just hiring and firing, okay? Which is where the Employee Handbook comes along. So when we talk about what those risks are, right, in the employment law areas that we just talked about, if it's the government that is doing something, right, that you terminated somebody inappropriately, that you did not, you weren't ADA compliant, you violated the Fair Labor Standards Act, those sort of things. If the government is the one saying, hey, you did this wrong, all right, you can look at penalties and fines. If it's extreme enough, potential criminal concerns, right? Those are things like consistently employing somebody who's not eligible to work in the United States, right? Or even tax implications. And this is going to happen fairly frequently when you see things like, well, we had this employee classified this way, and they've been that way for 4 or 5 years, and then we find out, oh, they're really supposed to be classified like this. Well, have you been withholding the correct taxes and wage categories and all that stuff from their previous classification? Because regardless of how you had it classified, you may still be liable for that, right? So there are some serious tax implications that you might want to worry about here. And then, of course, if it's a private individual, hey, you fired me, or hey, I was sexually harassed or at my job, and I'm going to sue the employee. Those are private individual lawsuits. That's the way an individual is going to exercise those rights or take action against the company. Okay. So these are two things that we're looking to guard against, or to protect the company and hopefully all the people in the company against, which is government action and private action against us. Okay. So moving on, let's talk more specifically about an employee handbook and how it does that, or how it helps us in that theory. Oh, by the way, I meant to say earlier, if anybody is in the chat, if anybody's listening, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I'll monitor that and hopefully be able to address it as we go along. Or if you want, you can wait till the end. We have a little time for conversation towards the end. But If you have questions, go ahead and stick them in the chat, and I'll grab them as soon as I can. All right. So an employee handbook specifically is a guidebook for employees and for management, right? So it lists what's expected of employees, what the company is going to do and not do, and how it's going to do it in a lot of cases, and what the benefits and programs of the company are. Now, when I say benefits, that may be things like health insurance, life insurance, 401k, those sort of benefits. But it may also be things like, sick time, PTO, use of the company equipment for work. People would have to, but things like a shift beer, that's a benefit, right? And what are those programs of the company? How does the company administer those benefits so that everybody's treated equally and within the law, right? So it's a guidebook that should be referenced, if not first, very soon after that, when an issue comes up, when a question comes up. Okay, what does the employee manual say? Oh, we don't have that addressed. Okay, do we need to address it in the employee manual? So we need to create something in that for next time. And how do we address it now so that it's fair? And it should have policies. Again, how the company, your guidebook or your handbook should include your corporate policies, how the company is administered, processes for employees, and how to manage employees and their needs. So I'll give you an example of that for managing employees. What do you do with complaints, right? What is the process for handling an issue that comes out? We're going to talk about it a little bit later as a policy you really need to have. But let's say that you've got an employee comes to you, to the manager at your tap room and says, hey, that guy over there just groped me, right? And he's an employee of the company, or that person just sexually harassed me or assaulted me. Okay. So then what does that manager do, right? There should be a structured process for this. There should be a structured policy that says, this is how the company is going to deal with these issues, and maybe there's a separate procedure that's not in the handbook, but, as much detail as you want to put in the handbook that you're willing to live up to should be there. So somewhere there should be a procedure or a policy that says, okay, on finding out about this, the whoever it was reported to, the first thing they do is call X person, right? The president of the company or the manager of the LLC or something. The next is, first is probably secure the location, make sure that everybody is safe and separated and, personal safety kind of things. Anyway, those are the kind of processes that we're talking about, right? Whether it's an employee initiated process or a management initiated process. How are those things identified? How are they wrapped up? And how are they stepped through so you can do the same thing every time? Because what you don't want to end up with is somebody comes and says, I was sexually harassed by that guy, and you treat it one way. Somebody else comes up 3 days later and says, I was sexually harassed by a different person, and you treat that differently, right? These need to be treated fairly and systemically in all cases, so you don't end up with issues of discrimination, disparate treatment, hostile work environment, all of those pieces, right? So that's what an employee handbook is. Let's talk more specifically about what's in it and what better be there, right? So your must-have policies, things that you should have a policy on. If you don't, you're running a risk, right? So first chunk, I kind of break up into employee and employer relationship policies. Know your state. Is this a right to work state? Is this an at-will employment state? And make it clear in that employee manual, in that employee handbook, what the company's position is on this, right? You should also have an equal employment opportunity policy and an immigration compliance policy. When I say immigration compliance, that can be buried into an onboarding policy or a minimum qualifications or however you want to address that. But that, as part of your onboarding, people need to provide documentation that they're legally allowed to work in the country, right? And you should have a policy about that. Next is in that employee classification, right? You need to have employee classification policies. One, specifically about records, right? How are employee records treated and how long are they kept? That's a requirement. Both, if I'm your lawyer, I'm going to say, okay, you need to keep them this long just to guard against somebody coming back and filing a lawsuit 2 years from now, right? Is this a 3-year statute of limitations? Is this a 5-year statute of limitations? If you're worried about taxes, it's a 7-year time frame you need to look at. And then when we talk about classification specifically, we talked about exempt and non-exempt. There's a technical definition for exempt and non-exempt from an IRS standpoint or a tax standpoint. I always think about it as if you were an exempt employee, you are exempt from overtime, because if you work 45 hours a week, you still get paid the same amount, right? Non-exempt folks get paid overtime, right? Now, does that mean that all salaried individuals are exempt? No, it does not. There is a test for that, right? You can be salaried and still non-exempt. So make sure that you're classifying people correctly, because one of the things that can happen is if you classify them as exempt, pay them a salary, 3 years later, they should have been classified as non-exempt and they've been working overtime. You may be liable for all of that extra overtime that you didn't pay them. So be very careful and very clear about that. Same thing with part-time, full-time, and temporary employees, right? So what qualifies as to what? How do you define part-time? And you know, for the most part, that's going to be largely an employment law question, right? Full-time is 40 hours and above, or 38 and above. Part-time is anything less than that. You may have a policy about where that falls, right? You know, you may have a policy that unless you're working full-time, you're not going to give employees more than 20 hours a week or something. Or just like a temporary employee, do you have to be a temporary employee before you're a permanent employee? I know, for example, in our company, we've got a 90-day probation process, right? You're here as an employee temporarily based on those first 90 days of probationary. After that, you can become a full employee or a full-time employee, or even as a part-time employee, you still are there temporarily until you reach some milestone. You also want to have policies that I think relate to performance. And the two big pieces to that are expectations of the employee and discipline, right? How are you going to enforce those expectations? I cannot tell you how critically important it is to have a documented disciplinary process. A lot of us who have worked in other organizations are familiar with these. It's a verbal warning that's been documented, sometimes called a verbal written, a written warning that then goes in your personnel file, your employee file, and then finally, you know, maybe a termination or individual improvement plan or whatever those next steps are. It should be documented, right? And you should have a process that you execute each time for employee discipline. Now, I say that, but I have counseled a lot of companies. If it is egregious enough, you can, you know, there are, and again, you should have a policy about this. What things are egregious enough that you can skip the disciplinary process? And as an employee, if you do this, you go right to termination, right? There are going to be those sort of situations. You know, I throw out there something like physical violence to a customer. Okay, you should have the expectation you don't do that. If you do, you are eligible directly for termination. We're not doing a written warning. We're not doing a second warning. Don't hit a customer again. We're going to skip right to discipline or to termination. But the entire idea is what those situations are and what that process is and what they can expect needs to be in a policy, and you need to communicate that policy. And for God's sake, you need to follow that policy. Okay. More must-haves. Policies on compensation, pay period, overtime, tips. How are you paying people? When are you paying people? Do they tip out at the end of the shift? Is it tip pooled at the end of the week? What are the requirements there? And by the way, your state has specific statutes and regulations about how to do those things. So even if the employee doesn't know or doesn't care or is new at this, let's say, you need to make sure that you've got a policy, you communicated that policy to the employee, and that policy lines up with federal and state law. right? We talked about benefits earlier, health benefits, those sort of things, also things like workers' compensation. What kinds of things are workers' compensation? Yes, we're going to have a workers' comp policy. In most states, it's required. But does that mean that anything that happens within 50 feet of the place of work is a workers' comp issue? Not necessarily, right? If you're getting out of your car, step on ice and break your elbow, well, is that workers' comp? Well, it depends. Why were you going to or from your car? If it was part of your job, or like, you're a salesperson, and so you were coming back from a sales call, maybe that is workers' comp. If it's you're just arriving at the office or at the brewery and you slip and fall, that's probably just general liability and not a workers' compensation issue, because at that point, while you're technically near your job, you're not actually performing your job at that time, right? Other policy issues here: attendance, specifically about absences. If you've got a tap room, especially if you've got a busy tap room, you can have a fair amount of turnover. And that means call outs, that means people being there, not being there, having to cover shifts, swap shifts around. What are your policies around how long that can happen, how that has to happen, who they have to call first, all those pieces. Health and safety, we already talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act accommodation, but you should also have a health and safety policy that's more broad, that addresses what are the health and safety issues of your facility, of the people. Let me rephrase that. What are the health and safety potential hazards and risks, and what are you doing about them that is specific to your location and the jobs that are happening on site, right? So things there might be, well, for example, health and safety concerns are different for the taproom folks than they are for the brewery folks. If you're dealing with hot caustic, that's a substantially different risk than somebody hooking up a keg in the cooler or the kegerator. So you should have a health and safety policy specifically around what to do if somebody notices a health issue or has a safety issue and needs management to address it, right? What's the policy? What's the process for that? Last one on this slide, I think it may even be the let me check my notes here. It may even be the last one on the must-haves. It is on information technology. This has become a huge issue in the last 5 to 10 years, specifically the last 3 or 4 years, especially since the pandemic. You need to have an IT policy. There is no part of any business that is not touched in some way by technology, right? Whether that's your POS system, people logging in and running drinks and pints and running credit cards, or whether that's back in the brew house where you're using a computer to order equipment, to order ingredients, and put up your recipes, track, using Ecos or something like that to track your brewery production. Your employees are using technology a lot. You need to have a policy around that is clearly communicated about what's acceptable and what's not, right? You're going to give an employee an email address that probably has your brewery name in it. What can they use that address for, right? That is probably not the address you want them to be used to be signing up for a I can think of a lot of politically incorrect things to say here, but to something controversial, right? Or something that could be widely publicized, right? If they log in or are caught with child pornography, you sure don't want them to be tracking your brewery website email address as the place that they've done that through. And at least if you have a policy, you can say they were knowingly violating the policy. We did everything we could to prevent this from happening. They were using this elsewhere. We couldn't do anything about this. We didn't know. To start insulating yourselves and particularly the company about any backlash or consequences that could come out of something like that. And that information technology policy should also talk about devices. We all now carry this wonderful device in our pockets. We can't leave anywhere without it. And I do work stuff on this. I do personal stuff on this. But whose device is it? Who does the device belong to? And what about the data on the device? So you really need to think about this here, because in the event, let's say, of a lawsuit, that device and anything on it might be discoverable information, right? Beyond the, oh, let's get all the texts that John sent. It might also include what information is held on that. What pictures does John have on that? What websites has John visited on that phone? When has John logged in on his phone to company email? When has John logged into something like ECOS or our production management system via the phone? All that stuff could be potentially discoverable in litigation. And so the question is, whose data is that? Whose device is that? And similarly, if you say, oh no, that is the individual's device, the company shouldn't have anything on that. Well, are you requiring employees to use their phone in their job? Then that may create some problems, right? That may then be an unreimbursed business expense for them. Or there may be some tax and benefit complications there. The phone and its prevalence, in particular the phone, but all your devices, is outstripping our ability, or the federal and even the state lawmakers' ability to regulate, particularly in terms of tax code, to regulate what it means to have this device. But you need to have something that clearly enunciates to your employees, this is the way we view this. This is the way your device should be used on the company or on behalf of the company. And here's what that means for you in that sense. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the should have policies, the nice to have policies. And some of these are more, are closer to the should have or must have. And some are a little further away to be, okay, gosh, if we could, great. And I'll try and highlight those as we go through. Just a quick time check. I've got about 27 minutes into this, so I've got just about another 18 minutes or so left. We should be right on time. But again, if you have any questions, comments, throw it in the chat. I'll be happy to catch those. So other things that you should think about having in your employee handbook in way of policies or guidance, your vision and mission. Right? So what is it that you want your business to be? What's the vision for what this needs to look like? Same with that mission statement. Do you have a mission behind the company? We are here to do this. And for God's sake, please don't use a mission like we're here to sell good beer. No joke. We're all here to do that. But more tightly than that, do you have an idea of what you want the people to be like, the culture, the atmosphere, the employment experience, employee experience, any of that stuff, to help people understand the culture and understand your expectations as an employer. Specifically on employee-employer relationships, consider having a policy on background checks. And I'm talking about more than criminal records. Criminal records could have an impact, depending on your state laws, about what they can do for the brewery or tap room, right? But beyond that, people lie on the resume. So do you check references? How often do you check references? Do you verify education? Do you verify previous employment? Those pieces can be important. If they lied on their resume and you didn't do anything about it, at what point do you lose the ability to do that, right? Do you go, oh, your resume from 8 years ago you lied on, we just figured that out, so we're going to fire you? I think that's a hard conversation, right? I think that's very difficult, and I think they could come back and say, well, but you've had all this time to check that out, and look at my employee evaluations, I've been doing great. That's not a good reason now, right? Depending on your right to work or at will works state status. Going back to employee classification, employee files and information. What are you storing? What do they have access to? And how is that access controlled, right? So what I really don't want to see from a client is, oh yeah, our employee files, they're in that drawer over there. Okay. Is there a lock on that drawer? No. Is it in a locked room? No. So anybody could walk in and take an employee file or rifle through it that has personal information, including social security numbers that you use to verify immigration status, and home phone, mother's maiden names, all this personal information. Anybody could just walk in and take it or do something with it or modify it. Well, that's not cool, right? So what are those processes and procedures? When we talk about employee performance, these are really important, I think. These are closer to the must-have on the should-have spectrum. Confidentiality. What is confidence? Excuse me. That's not the right way to put that. What confidentiality do you require of your employees, right? If they're on the taproom side, they're probably handling customer data fairly frequently, right? So, what is the expectation there? You should keep customer information confidential. Certainly if they have access to customer emails, like an email list or customer list, or let's see what else. Oh, confidentiality on the brew house side. Nobody needs to know what goes into that beer other than the people who make it, right? So, maybe your assistant brewer shouldn't be posting that recipe or the cost of goods, so the cost per barrel production cost per barrel to produce that beer on the internet, right? So what is it that you expect to be maintained as confidential? Other policies specifically around employee performance: appearance, customers, and presentation. So what do I mean by that? Well, do you have a uniform that you want people to wear, right? Some places do. Okay, the taproom uniform, you need to have a shirt on that we'll provide, but you need to have a brewery branded shirt on. Is that as important for the brewers in the back that nobody ever sees? Probably not. But is that part of your image that you're presenting to customers? What about when you go to festivals? Anything there that you want or don't want, right? Customers, how do you want customers to be treated? What are the expectations for employees working with customers or retail accounts if they're distributing it, right? Or if you're self-distributing or working on sales calls. This is the one where I've written for a couple of clients. The customer is not always right, but the customer will always be respected, right? Things like that you say, okay, yep, this customer is a moron, but we're going to treat them well, and we're going to respectfully ask that X, Y, and Z happen. Right? Or at what point do you have issues with customers that need to be escalated? How do you want customers to be dealt with there? And this leads to the presentation, right? What do you expect them to do? Or how do you expect them to present the brewery, whether they're working with a customer out in the public at a festival or anywhere else? So what does that look like? And what, again, going back to building the culture that you want for your environment. All right. More should have policies. A lot of these probably ought to be must-haves, but we're going to call them should-haves because a lot of people don't have them, but should have them. And a lot of them are specific to you, specific conduct. You should have a policy on harassment, preferably at least two, one on sexual harassment, and then and if you want to divide into other kinds of harassment, right? Hostile work environment, etc. And the other one you actually absolutely need to have, or absolutely should have, is a process or a procedure policy. In the event X happens, we do Y, then Z, then this, then this, then this, right? Here's our process for addressing issues that come up, right? And I definitely want to see one of those for harassment. I'm going to suggest it for all of these, especially discrimination. Same issue. If they feel discriminated against, what's the process, right? And it needs to be documented, fair, and consistent, and repeatable the same way every time. Do you need to have a policy about bullying, workplace bullying? What does that look like? What do you consider bullying? What's just friendly banter and trash talking for fun? How do you differentiate between those two? This next one on alcohol, far too few breweries and tap rooms have an alcohol policy. We work with alcohol for a living. You should have an alcohol policy, right? things that should go in that alcohol policy. If you have a shift beer, what does that look like? What's the process for that? How many of those can you have? Can you go behind the bar to get one? Some states don't allow that, so be careful about that. But what are those specifics for that shift beer? Short fills. Do employees get short fills? But more importantly, I think one of the things we want to talk very clearly about is, because we do work with alcohol, what's your alcohol intake tolerance? I will tell you, I believe from a legal perspective, an employee shows up drunk, you need to send them home. How do you determine they're drunk? Right? And I would look for specific language in that alcohol policy. If you have red glassy eyes, if you have slurred speech, if you have trouble standing, same things that an officer might, who knows, ask you at the roadside. How do you identify that, and what are you going to do about it? So an alcohol policy. Drug policy is becoming very important now that more and more states are decriminalizing or legalizing recreational marijuana, cannabis, psilocybin, some of these other products. So what is your drug policy? Because again, remember, if you're a brewery, that is a federally licensed facility, and federally it's still illegal. If you are caught with it on federally licensed premises by federal agents, you could be in real trouble. They could revoke your permit. That's not a good thing. Is that likely to happen? I'd say not, but you want to think about the possibilities here. What about, it's far more likely to happen if you're in a state that is not decriminalized for cannabis or not legalized for cannabis, and you're in a state regulated alcohol premises. They could also probably, at some level, revoke your permit. Not good. So what are your employee policies around that? Also things between alcohol and drug. What about safety issues, right? If somebody's hit with a fork truck, right, or crashes a fork truck into a barrel rack, should there be an investigation about whether or not this person may have been appreciably impaired by drugs or alcohol? What does that look like? Social media is another policy you really ought to have. How do you want people to use social media? I'll give you an example. A lot of employees on their Facebook, Twitter, Instagram list where they work, right? They list the brewery or tap room that they're working for, even though they're using that on their own personal time. What does that look like if they do something that reflects negatively on the company on their personal time, right? Somebody on their personal Facebook page or personal Instagram says something extremely racist, and they say, oh, look, this person works at that brewery. That brewery must condone that kind of behavior. We're going to start boycotting that brewery now, or we're going to call out that brewery because this person works there. And that actually, or a variation on that, happened several years ago in Oregon. That's one of the reasons I added this to my slides. Back in, well, I don't have time to go into the story, but you get the idea. It's a risk. Unsafe or inappropriate activities. What do you consider unsafe and inappropriate, right? What is your tolerance? What's the company's tolerance for employee safety? Just recently here in North Carolina, an individual was killed after falling. Well, he died after falling from the brew house while inspecting a tank. I have seen more than one time employees climbing up a pallet rack to get a piece of equipment or get down an empty keg or get down a bag of grain. Wait a minute, that's not entirely safe. What do we feel is inappropriate? What's the right way to do things? And what's the system to accomplish that stuff? And of course, you should probably also have one on retaliation and enforcement. What if somebody says, hey, that guy is bullying me at work? Well, what's our policy around retaliation? Does that guy then start coming back at me because I'm a whistleblower, right? Even if I was being thin-skinned or too sensitive, what happens next, right? Can the company fire me because I said was feeling uncomfortable or bullied? What does that look like? So retaliation and enforcement really important in many state law, employment law issues. More on the stuff you ought to have. How close are we? Checking my notes. We're getting there. We're getting there. Don't worry. Hang in there with me. Compensation. Adjustments promotes remote work. This one's getting more and more important. What is your policy about remote work? Is this a completely remote position? What are the pieces that are treated differently for that remote person, or when a person is working remote versus when they're on site? What about off the clock work, right? When I'm salary and I'm going to work over the weekend instead of during the day and make up my time for the couple hours I missed on Friday. Do you allow that? What's the concerns? What are the circumstances in which that's acceptable? Especially if you have a tip pool, you need to have a tip pool policy. And again, check your state law. There are a lot of concerns there, or a lot of details and statutory requirements. We talked about discipline process. I want to see that spelled out clearly. We talked about information technology, but specifically to the use of company systems and devices. I recently had a client who had an employee put a keylogger malware on their system and then harvested customer data and was selling that. Huge, privacy breach, identity theft, and client didn't do anything, didn't know about it, found out later, and now has to work with the police, all because they didn't have a policy, and I don't know if it would have stopped them if they did. Where they said you can't do that. You're not allowed to use. You can only use the company PCs for company stuff, for example. Attendance. More on this. These are additional variations. These are additional tweaks to the attendance policy we already talked about. What about if you have multiple locations, meal periods and breaks, if you work long enough? What's the difference between late versus absent, right? How late is it? Oh, all right, no, you should have been here 3 hours ago, just go home, and we're going to count it off. Vacation, PTO or sick leave, holidays, military leave, temporary, we've got a whole list here I'll let you go through. These are all different kinds of absence work or absences at work. Should they be treated differently, and if so, how? All right, going back to health and safety. Do you have a smoking policy? A lot of states, especially on the taproom side, it's just simply no smoking. All right, do you have one outside? Do you have space outside, or is your premises non-smoking? Does that extend to vaping or just smoking? What about drug and alcohol? And this goes back to, if there's an accident, are we going to investigate drug or alcohol use as part of that accident investigation? Safety. What happens if I see an unsafe thing, or worse yet, I have a supervisor say, yeah, just climb that pallet rack and get that 55-pound sack of grain down. I'm like, I don't feel safe doing that. Well, that's not what I said. I told you to do it. What happens? What's the employee's recourse? What is the expectation of the employee and the manager at that point? What about workplace violence and security? If somebody's threatened somebody at work, that may be bullying, it may not be, but either way, what are you going to do with it when one employee threatens another, for example, or a customer threatens an employee? How are you going to deal with that stuff? And inclement weather. All over the country, we've got issues of weather that sometimes shut us down as a business. What does that mean, and who makes the call and when? And of course, what does voluntary termination look like when they choose to quit versus sending them out the door? And specifically on this one, I like to suggest, this is on the really nice to have but not must sort of have area, is if you decide to quit, I want to do an exit interview. I want to talk about what worked, what didn't work, why you chose to leave, and what we could do better next time. But I'd want to have that listed in that policy manual so people know what's coming. Okay. Best practices. Absolutely. If you have an employee manual, every employee gets a copy. Consider having a policy committee, getting employees involved in writing those policies. You really need to review your handbook at least annually just to see if it still makes sense. Think about creating an input process where people say, hey, I think we need a policy on this, right? Reissuing the handbook when things get changed. If you have an intranet behind a firewall, consider adding it there where people can get to it electronically. Do not put it on your website. That's a bad idea. But if you have a employee area inside the website, that may be an option. What not to do. I think this is my second to last slide. So I'm going to wrap this up. Don't ignore employee issues or employee management. Don't fail to document. When you see something, do it, document it when you get it, when you know about it, do something about it. Do not treat employees differently. Make sure you're treating everybody consistently and similarly, again, via the policy manual. Once you know of an issue, you need to follow up. Do not ignore it. Do not hope it goes away. Do not delegate employee management to someone who is not diligent. Employee management is all about consistency and documentation. If you have a supervisor or a manager who can't do that or doesn't do it well, they don't need to be supervising employees. It will get you in trouble. Do not trust people to monitor themselves, right? That's a real concern. I know everybody wants to work with friends and all that sort of stuff, but you have to have some sort of monitoring involved here, some sort of level of oversight, right? And in fact, all of these things, well, I'll say, I want to draw your attention to the last two things, and then I'll stop. I'll have a policy. Have a policy that you have drafted that fits your organization. The only thing worse than not having a policy is having a policy that you don't follow. Okay, that is not an excuse to not have a policy. You really need to have a policy, and you need to follow it. If you have a policy and you're not following it, rewrite the policy. That's the words I want you to take home today. All right, I am over my time by a couple of minutes here. I am going to go ahead and stop at this point. I have one more slide, but it's just my contact information. If you have anything, I didn't see too much coming in on the chat. Let me double check that. Yep, I didn't see any questions coming in the chat. If you get this and you think of others questions, feel free to email us. We're happy to talk about stuff. Like I said, if I don't do it, I can help find you somebody who does, or help point you in the right direction. We love talking about beer. We love talking about beer law. Happy to chat whenever. If you have anything or any questions, we can help answer. I'm John at Beer Law Center. Check us out at all the socials at Beer Law Center. And if you need anything, give us a call. Otherwise, have a great conference. Enjoy the rest of the week, and I'll see y'all around. Cheers, y'all.